The story you are about to hear is a wonderful tale of revenge and romance. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to the channel and comment with your location. Thank you for watching. Now that you're finally back, I hope you know you're easily replaceable. Richard Vance said it with that smug grin he reserved for moments when he thought he had the upper hand. I had just walked into the main office of Atlas Engineering after a week's vacation in the Smoky Mountains. And those were the first words out of his mouth. Not welcome back or how was your trip? Just that. My name is Arthur. I'm 49 years old, and I've been handling government contracts for Atlas for 12 years. 12 years of security clearances, relationships and deals that kept the company running. But Richard just saw me as another engineer in a cheap suit. The office air conditioner hummed with that constant mechanical drone I had learned to ignore over the years. The smell of reheated coffee from the break room mixed with the artificial cleaning scent the janitorial crew used on Fridays. Everything seemed normal, but something had changed. I could feel it in the furtive glances from my colleagues, the way they avoided eye contact as I walked past their cubicles. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, setting my briefcase down next to my desk. The leather case was worn at the edges, a gift from John Roberts when I hit my 5-year mark with the company. Back then, gifts like that meant recognition, loyalty, mutual respect. Richard chuckled as if he'd told a brilliant joke and went back to his corner office. I watched him through the glass partition, adjusting his imported tie and checking his reflection in the computer screen. He did that at least 10 times a day, always making sure every hair was in place, that the tie was perfectly centered, as if appearance could compensate for a lack of substance. Richard had been my boss for 3 years, ever since the company restructured. Before that, I reported directly to the CEO, John Roberts. Things were different then. John understood that government contracts weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people, trust, years of invisible work that created solid foundations. I sat down and opened my emails. 47 messages about the Henderson defense contract. The one Richard had been bragging about for months, telling everyone how he'd landed the big one. The $25 million fish that I had spent 6 months nurturing through procurement channels he didn't even know existed. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard. 6 months of 5 a.m. meetings with East Coast personnel. 6 months of explaining technical specifications in language that both engineers and bureaucrats could understand. 6 months of building trust, answering emails at 11 at night, ensuring every detail was perfect. And Richard took the credit in 2 sentences during executive meetings. The phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through my thoughts. It was Colonel Patricia Burns from the Department of Defense. Her voice had that precise professional quality that came from decades of dealing with contractors who overpromised and underdelivered. "Arthur, good to have you back. We need to discuss the timeline adjustments for Phase 2. "Of course, Colonel, let me pull up the specs." My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through folders I knew by heart. Every file, every document, every side note was the result of years of meticulous work. Richard's voice boomed from his office. He was on another call, probably with John, taking credit for the preliminary approvals that had come in while I was gone. I'd heard variations of this conversation before. "The team really stepped up," he'd say, with that tone that suggested false modesty. "Good leadership makes all the difference," as if he knew anything about leadership beyond what he'd read in corporate self-help books. I finished the call with Colonel Burns and stared at my computer screen. The cursor blinked in the search field of a job site I had bookmarked months ago, but never used. It was one of those sites I visited in moments of frustration, browsing openings that required my exact experience, imagining what it would be like to work for someone who actually understood the value of what I did. My finger hovered over the mouse. The room suddenly felt quieter, as if the office itself was waiting for a decision. 12 years. I built every government relationship this company had. I knew which contract officers preferred technical specifications delivered in person, with a bound hard copy, not just a PDF sent via email. Which ones needed a minimum of 3 weeks for review cycles, and which competitors were vying for the same contracts we were. Richard didn't know any of that. To him, it was all about having the lowest bid and the slickest PowerPoint. Richard walked out of his office, adjusting the Italian suit jacket that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Don't forget the quarterly report is due Friday," he said without looking at me, his eyes already on his phone, probably checking game scores or his stock portfolio. And Arthur, next time you take a vacation during a critical contract phase, maybe give the team a heads up. I nodded and watched him walk toward the elevator. The team. As if there was anyone else in that building who could navigate the labyrinth of federal procurement requirements that kept Atlas profitable. As if the relationships I'd spent years building could be transferred with an internal memo and a brief training session. Something settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just clarity. The same clarity that comes when you finally understand a situation isn't going to get better, no matter how long you wait or how much patience you have. It was like looking at a map and finally seeing the path forward, even if that path led away from everything you'd known for over a decade. I started at Atlas Engineering right after getting out of the Navy, 27 years old, fresh from a tour where I handled procurement logistics. In some places, the Pentagon preferred not to name publicly. Places where a spec error could cost lives, not just money. Places where you learned fast the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. John Roberts himself hired me back then, in an interview that took place in a small diner near the airport, because he was flying back from a conference in DC. He said he needed someone who understood how government contracts actually worked, not just how they looked on paper. Someone who knew that behind every technical requirement was a person, a history, a reason. In those early years, I was everywhere. Trade shows in Washington, where you'd meet half the defense industry in hallways between boring lectures on regulatory compliance. Meetings in secure facilities near Atlanta, where you left your phone in a locker at the entrance and discussed specifications in windowless rooms. Conference calls that started at 5 in the morning because someone in Aberdeen needed clarification on technical specs before an 8 o'clock meeting. I learned which civil servants were career-long, the ones who had seen administrations come and go, who knew how the system really worked beneath the official policies, and which ones were on 18-month assignments, trying to make a name for themselves before returning to the private sector. I learned who made the real decisions and who just signed the paperwork after everything had already been decided 3 levels below. My security clearance was higher than anyone else's at Atlas, top secret with compartmentalized access, the kind of clearance that took 3 years of background checks to obtain. They interviewed neighbors I had when I lived in an apartment during college. They reviewed tax returns since I started working. They spoke with ex-girlfriends, professors, even the owner of the gym where I worked out. The kind of clearance that couldn't be transferred or rushed, no matter how much money someone threw at the process. Richard didn't have a clearance. He hadn't even bothered to start the process, which told you everything about how much he really understood the business he was supposed to be managing. For 9 years, I worked directly with John. We'd sit in his office every Monday morning, coffee still hot, reviewing opportunities, contract renewals, and relationship maintenance. He understood what it took to keep government clients happy. It's not about the lowest bid, he'd tell me, looking out his window at the Memphis skyline. It's about trust and expertise they can't get anywhere else. Anyone can make a pretty spreadsheet. Few can deliver consistently for years on end. Then came the restructuring. John said the company was growing, that it needed more layers of management. Modern corporate structure, he called it. As if extra layers of bureaucracy could somehow improve relationships that had been built through years of consistent delivery and mutual trust. Richard came from a commercial construction company, had an MBA from a famous university in Atlanta. Themery, he'd mention in practically every conversation, as if those 3 letters explained everything. A fresh perspective, John called him in the meeting where he introduced Richard to the team. Someone who can bring business discipline to government contracting. In Richard's first week, he asked me for a simple overview of our government business. I should have seen the red flag in the word simple. I spent 3 days preparing a presentation that covered 12 active contracts, 18 potential opportunities, and the relationship map I'd built for nearly a decade. Every slide had stories behind it. The Wright-Patterson Air Force Base contract that started with a casual conversation in a coffee line at a conference. The Aberdeen project we almost lost until I found out the contract officer was a former Marine like me, and we built trust over shared experiences. He listened for 20 minutes, his eyes wandering to his laptop several times. Then he asked, with that expression that suggested he'd identified an obvious problem everyone else had overlooked, "Can't we just submit a lower bid and win more contracts?" That should have been my warning. But I told myself he was new, that he would learn. That John wouldn't have hired someone so fundamentally disconnected from the reality of our business. For the next 3 years, I watched Richard take credit for every successful bid, while distancing himself from the complicated relationship work that made those successes possible. He'd show up for the final meetings, when everything was already settled, and present the results as if they were the fruit of his strategic vision. When Colonel Burns called with complex technical questions about integration timelines or security specifications, she asked to speak specifically with me. When the folks in Huntsville wanted to discuss testing and certification requirements, they scheduled the calls around my availability, not Richard's. But in the quarterly management meetings, the ones held in the 10th floor conference room with a view of the river, Richard presented everything as a result of his leadership. He had sleek charts showing revenue growth, colorful slides with words like synergy and strategic alignment. And John would nod in approval, because the numbers looked good, and Richard knew how to give an impressive presentation. The worst part wasn't the stolen credit. I was old enough and experienced enough to know that office politics existed everywhere. The worst part was watching him slowly convince himself that government contracting was just like any other business, that you could apply the same management techniques that worked in commercial construction or software sales, that relationships were interchangeable, that technical expertise could be bought or outsourced, that security clearances were just another administrative checkbox. He would interrupt my calls with contract officers to suggest efficiency improvements. Once, he walked into the conference room in the middle of a sensitive discussion with a contract officer about compartmentalized security requirements and asked if we could wrap up the call because he needed the room for a team meeting. The officer on the other end of the line was silent for 5 full seconds, a silence that spoke volumes about what he thought of our company's professionalism. Richard scheduled meetings at times I had specifically told him, via email and in person, that I was managing critical proposal deadlines. "I need you here, Arthur," he'd say, as if his meeting about departmental performance metrics was more important than ensuring a $15 million proposal was submitted correctly. Last month, 3 weeks before my vacation in the Smoky Mountains, I overheard him on a call with John. His office door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried that tone of barely concealed pride. "The government division is finally running like a real business unit, John. Standardized processes, clear performance metrics, defined accountability. We're bringing discipline to an area that has always operated too informally." As if the previous 11 years of consistent growth and careful relationship building had been an amateur operation. As if trust and expertise were signs of a lack of professionalism, not the cornerstones of a specialized business. The last straw came 3 days after Richard's comment about me being easily replaceable. It was Wednesday, around 6 in the evening. The office was mostly empty, just a few lights on in cubicles where people were working on tight deadlines. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot, engine running, air conditioner fighting the September heat in Memphis. I hadn't left right away. I had sat there for 20 minutes, just looking at the building through the windshield, thinking about 12 years, thinking about how many times I had come in early and left late, how many calls I'd taken on vacations, weekends, holidays, how many times I had put Atlas's needs above my personal life because I believed I was part of something bigger. My phone buzzed. A text from Strategic Solutions. Vincent Chase, the CEO. "Arthur, still interested in that senior partner position we discussed? Give me a call." Vincent was the CEO of Strategic Solutions, Atlas's biggest competitor in the government sector. We had spoken informally at a defense industry conference 6 months earlier. It was one of those conversations that happen in hotel bars after a long day of lectures, where everyone lets their guard down a bit and speaks honestly about the industry. He'd mentioned they were looking for someone with my background. I'd politely demurred, muttering something about loyalty and being happy in my current position. Loyalty. The word felt hollow now, sitting in that truck. Remembering Richard's smug grin and that casual comment about being easily replaceable, I thought about Colonel Burns, who specifically requested me for the Henderson contract. She didn't request Atlas. She didn't request the government division. She requested me by name because she trusted my judgment and my ability to deliver. I thought about the contract officer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, an Army veteran with 30 years of experience and zero tolerance for incompetence. He wouldn't return Richard's calls, but he always picked up when I called, even if it was just to chat about how projects were progressing. I thought about the other 3 major contracts in the pipeline. The Aberdeen project worth $8 million annually. The Wright-Patterson radar modernization, $15 million over 5 years. The testing facility contract that was in a preliminary phase, but could grow to $12 million. All of them existed solely because of the relationships I had spent years building. Conversations that started as formal introductions and evolved into partnerships based on mutual trust. Easily replaceable. The words echoed in my head. I looked at the Atlas building again. The lights in Richard's office were still on, probably working on another presentation about revenue growth, attributing successes he hadn't earned to strategies he hadn't developed. I called Vincent. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Arthur, good to hear from you." His voice had that direct quality of someone who got where he was by understanding people and opportunities. "Look, I'll get straight to the point. We just had a senior partner retire after 20 years, and we need someone who can step in immediately. Full partner status, equity stake, and any government relationship you bring with you stays under your management. No micromanagement, no splitting credit. You build it, you run it, you reap the rewards." His words were the exact opposite of everything I had experienced with Richard. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" 2 weeks to start would be ideal. 1 week if you can swing it. "I know it's tight, but we have contract opportunities coming up that are perfect for someone with your background. And frankly, Arthur, I've heard rumors about how things are at Atlas. The industry is small. People talk." I stood there for a long moment watching Richard through his office window. He was gesturing animatedly on what looked like another call, probably with John, probably explaining how well the government division was doing under his visionary leadership. "Send me the paperwork," I said. My voice sounded calm, but my hand trembled slightly as I hung up the phone. I drove home the long way, needing time to process the decision I had just made. The streets of Memphis were thick with rush hour traffic. People heading home from normal days at normal jobs, where they probably felt valued and respected. I wondered how long it had been since I felt that way. That night, sitting at my dining table with a beer I barely touched, I reread Vincent's text 3 times. Then I opened my laptop and started making a mental list of all of Atlas's active government contracts. Each one had a story. Each one represented months or years of work. And each one depended on personal relationships I had built through consistent delivery, technical expertise, and mutual trust. Richard thought those contracts were company assets. He was about to find out he was wrong. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 7, an hour before normal. I wanted to do this before my courage failed, before 12 years of loyalty made me reconsider. I typed my resignation letter on the blank computer screen. 2 simple sentences, direct, no explanations or justifications that Richard didn't deserve. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position at Atlas Engineering. Thank you for the opportunity. I printed it, signed it with the pen John had given me for my 10-year anniversary, and took it straight to his office. The door was ajar. John was reading something on his screen, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, that look of concentration I knew from hundreds of meetings. He looked up from his computer, surprised to see me so early. "Arthur, good morning. What can I do for you?" "Richard is right," I said, placing the letter on his desk with more force than I intended. The paper made a sharp sound against the wood. "I am easily replaceable, so you'll have no problem finding someone else to manage the Henderson contract, the Wright-Patterson renewal, the Aberdeen proposal that's due next month, or the other 18 active government relationships that keep this division profitable." John's face went pale as he read the letter. He took off his glasses slowly, as if the motion could somehow change the words on the page. "Arthur, wait, sit down. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about, John." My voice was calm but firm. 12 years of pent-up frustration gave weight to every word. For 3 years, I've watched Richard systematically devalue the work I do. For 3 years, I've listened to him take credit for relationships he didn't build and contracts he doesn't understand. Can't you let it happen because he talks a good game and has an MBA from Emory? I didn't know things were this bad, John began, but I cut him off. You knew, John. You chose not to do anything because the numbers looked good in his quarterly presentations. But those numbers were my work, not his. And now you're going to find out what the difference is. I was already walking toward the door when he called out, "Where are you going?" I've accepted a position at Strategic Solutions. They seem to think my experience has value. That relationships matter. That 12 years of building trust with government clients can't be replaced by an MBA and a cocky attitude. I cleaned out my desk while Richard was at lunch. I didn't want a confrontation, didn't want drama. I just wanted to leave with my dignity. 12 years of meticulously organized files, manually updated contact lists, handwritten relationship notes on the individual preferences of contract officers. It all went into 3 cardboard boxes I'd brought from the supply closet. The government contracts database remained on the company server. They could have the numbers, the dates, the technical specs, but the real relationships, the ones built through answered calls at 11 at night, of consistently met deadlines, of expertise demonstrated over years, those were leaving with me. Because those were never in the files, they were in the trust that people like Colonel Burns had in me personally. Richard came back from lunch as I was loading the last box into my truck. He stopped at the parking lot door, car keys in hand, watching with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, maybe? Or that first pang of fear when you start to realize you've made a mistake you can't undo. But he didn't say anything, just stood there motionless as I closed the tailgate and got into the driver's seat. My phone buzzed as I pulled away from the Atlas parking lot for the last time. A text message to Richard's number with a copy to John's and the General Procurement Department number. Henderson defense contract cancelled. Effective immediately. Request discussion regarding transfer of contract to new prime contractor. Colonel Patricia Burns, Department of Defense. I pulled over 2 blocks away and read the message 3 times. My hand trembled slightly as I put the phone back in the console. Colonel Burns hadn't wasted any time. She had made it absolutely clear to Atlas what I already knew. Government contracts weren't about the company name on the letterhead. They were about the people who did the work. My phone rang 15 seconds later. John. I stared at the screen, his name flashing persistently. I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. And again. On the 4th call I answered. Arthur. His voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before. We need to talk now. There's nothing to talk about. John, you heard me clearly this morning. This is bigger than anything that happened between you and Richard. There was something close to panic in his voice. The Henderson contract. Colonel Burns just... I know, I got the message. A long silence. I could hear Richard talking quickly in the background, his voice rising several octaves above normal. Someone was finally panicking and it wasn't me. Arthur, please, come back to the office. We can fix this. No, John, we can't, because the problem isn't money or a title or a corner office. The problem is you let Richard spend 3 years systematically destroying the value of everything I built. And now you're going to find out exactly how much that cost. John called me at 6 that evening. I was at Strategic Solutions, on the 20th floor of a modern high-rise in downtown Memphis, signing paperwork in Vincent's office. The view was better than at Atlas, higher, clearer, more honest about where I was and where I was going. Arthur, we need to talk. John's voice was more controlled now, as if he'd spent the last few hours preparing for this call. This is bigger than anything that happened between you and Richard, is it? I kept my voice calm, professional. Vincent raised an eyebrow from across the desk, clearly hearing the tone of the conversation, but continuing to review the details of the partnership agreement. The Henderson contract is worth $25 million over 3 years. Colonel Burns won't take Richard's calls. She's saying the deal is off unless you are personally managing it. She was absolutely clear about it. No contract. I looked out the conference room window. Downtown Memphis stretched out below us. The Mississippi River was catching the last of the daylight, that deep golden color that only happens in the final minutes before sunset. The city looked different from this height. full of possibility. "That's a shame," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Don't play games with me, Arthur." His voice hardened. 12 years should count for something. You owe it to the company. You owe it to me. You're right. 12 years should count for something. I paused, letting the words settle. "But your restructuring put Richard in charge of decisions he doesn't understand, with relationships he didn't build, in a business he's never worked in. 3 years of watching that happen also counts for something." John's voice grew harsher. "Richard has an MBA from Emory. He understands business. He brought discipline and processes to a division that operated too informally. Government contracts aren't a normal business, John. They're relationships built over years. Trust that can't be forced or rushed. Security clearances that take years to obtain and can't be transferred. Richard doesn't have the clearance to access half the files needed to manage the Henderson contract, let alone the technical expertise to answer Colonel Burns' questions about systems integration or compartmentalized security requirements. We'll get him the clearance." John sounded defensive now. "We'll bring in consultants. We'll do whatever it takes." A top-secret clearance with compartmentalized access takes a minimum of 18 months, John, with no guarantee of approval. And that's assuming Richard passes the background check, which is no sure thing given. He's changed jobs 4 times in the last 10 years, and Colonel Burns has been working with me for 8 years. She trusts my judgment on technical specifications, timeline management, and systems integration. She's not going to start from scratch with someone new just because Richard has an MBA and knows how to make PowerPoint presentations. There was a long pause. Vincent finished reading the contract and slid the partnership agreement across the table. I signed it while John searched for words, my signature firm and clear on the dotted line. "What do you want?" John finally asked, and there was defeat in his voice. "I want Richard to understand that some people are not easily replaceable. I want you to understand that choosing managers based on academic credentials instead of industry expertise has consequences. I want both of you to learn that relationships aren't assets that show up on a spreadsheet, no matter how pretty the chart is. This is about ego. No, John, this is about competence. Richard spent 3 years taking credit for work he didn't do, relationships he didn't build, and an expertise he doesn't possess. He convinced himself government contracting was like commercial construction, where you can just swap one project manager for another, and everything keeps running. Now he's going to find out what the Atlas government division looks like without the person who actually runs it. And you're going to find out how much it costs to let a manager's ego destroy 12 years of relationship building. I hung up and handed the signed contract back to Vincent. He placed it in a folder with the Strategic Solutions logo and offered me his hand. "Tough conversation?" he asked, shaking my hand firmly. "Necessary." Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "Arthur, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you deserve honesty. I've been waiting for this for months. Ever since that conversation at the DC conference, I've been quietly keeping in touch with some of your clients. Not soliciting business, just listening. And what I heard was consistent. They work with you, not with Atlas. The company name on the proposal is secondary to the person managing the project." I nodded slowly. Colonel Burns made that pretty clear today. She wasn't the only one. I've been talking informally with the people at Wright-Patterson, Aberdeen, and 3 other facilities. They all said the same thing. If you change companies, they want to know where you went. Not because they don't trust Atlas, because they trust you. My phone began to vibrate incessantly with text messages. Richard, finally understanding that the Henderson contract wasn't just paperwork and processes, but a relationship with specific people who had worked with me for years. Then John again, his longest message yet, full of promises about changes and recognition. Then someone from Atlas's legal department, wanting to discuss options and mutual agreements. I turned off my phone and put it in the drawer of my new desk. Vincent watched with a slight smile. Wise decision. Let them sweat her. Little. The next morning brought 3 more cancelled contracts, each one arriving before 9 a.m., as if the clients had coordinated their messages for maximum impact. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base pulled out of a $15 million radar modernization project that had been in negotiation for 8 months. The Aberdeen Proving Ground suspended negotiations on a contract for testing facilities worth $8 million annually. A third contract I didn't even know was at risk. A smaller $3 million project with a Navy facility near Norfolk was also cancelled. Each cancellation came with the same basic message, though the words varied. Relationship with prime contractor terminated. Request discussion regarding future contractual agreements. And each one included a line that must have sent Richard into a full-blown panic. Please provide contact information for Arthur Silva for discussion of future contracts options. Vincent called me into his office at 10. He was on the phone when I walked in, but gestured for me to sit. As he finished the call, I watched Memphis out the window. The city seemed more vibrant than ever, full of energy and movement. Arthur, I have to ask. Vincent hung up and faced me directly. Did you know this was going to happen? When you signed with us yesterday, did you know the contracts would be cancelled? I considered the question carefully. I knew Richard had convinced himself that government contracting was just about having the right paperwork and submitting the lowest bid. I knew he didn't understand the relationship component, the security clearance requirements, or the expectations of technical expertise. What I didn't know was how quickly the clients would make their preferences so clear, or how coordinated they would be about it. And now Richard is going to learn that easily replaceable is a theory that doesn't survive contact with reality. He's going to find out that you can't manage relationships that take years to build with the same techniques you use to manage construction schedules. Vincent leaned back in his chair, hands steepled under his chin. Your old company just lost $48 million in active contracts because a manager with an MBA told an expert with 12 years of experience that he was easily replaceable. That's a business lesson that's going to be studied for years. That's one way of looking at it. What's the other? Richard spent 3 years systematically devaluing the person who built every government relationship Atlas had. He convinced himself that management credentials were more important than technical expertise and client trust. He treated government contracts like they were construction projects, where you can swap people out like interchangeable parts. Now he's finding out what those relationships were actually worth. And John is finding out the cost of choosing managers based on academic pedigree instead of industry knowledge. By noon, my phone had 17 missed calls from Atlas numbers. John had called 6 times, Richard 4, someone from Legal 3, and 4 from numbers I didn't recognize, probably board members or other executives who were finally grasping the extent of the problem. Vincent and I were reviewing Strategic's current government contract portfolio, identifying where my expertise could expand existing contracts or win new business when my personal cell phone rang. The unknown number, but I recognized the area code, Virginia, Department of Defense, and this is Arthur. Arthur, this is Patricia Burns. I wanted to call you directly on your personal cell, not a corporate number. Colonel Burns. I left Vincent's office and went to the empty conference room, closing the door quietly behind me. Colonel, good to hear from you. I hope everything is well. I'm calling because John Roberts has been trying to reach me for 2 days, leaving increasingly urgent messages, and I think there's some confusion about the Henderson contract situation that I need to clarify directly with you. I sat at the conference table and looked out at the Memphis skyline. What kind of confusion? Mr. Roberts seems to think this is a negotiation, that Atlas can somehow keep the Henderson contract if they offer the right terms or make the right personnel changes. I wanted to make it absolutely clear to you, so there are no misunderstandings. That is not the case. The Henderson contract is cancelled with Atlas, period. What I am interested in discussing is a new contract with Strategic Solutions, with you as the designated technical lead. I understand, Colonel. I appreciate the clarity. Arthur, I've been in defense acquisitions for 15 years. I've seen a lot of contractors come and go. I've seen companies rise and fall. I've seen mergers and restructurings and every variety of corporate drama you can imagine. And I've learned one thing that is universally true. Relationships matter more than company names. A lot more. She paused and I could hear papers being shuffled in the background, the distinct sound of someone reviewing technical documents. The Henderson project involves the integration of classified technology with timeline requirements that absolutely cannot accommodate learning curves or personnel transitions. The technical specifications require someone with your specific background, your clearance level, and frankly, your demonstrated ability to deliver complex projects on time and on budget. The timeline does not allow for training a replacement, even if Atlas had someone with the requisite clearances, which they apparently do not. The situation at Atlas is complicated. Arthur, I'll be even more direct. I have also received calls from my counterparts at Wright-Patterson, Aberdeen and Norfolk. The consensus is absolutely clear among all of us. We either work with you or we work with other contractors. Atlas without Arthur is not Atlas, as far as the Department of Defense and our acquisition needs are concerned. And to be completely honest, the way Atlas management allowed this situation to develop raises serious questions about their judgment and leadership capabilities. After the call ended, I stayed in the conference room for 10 minutes, just looking out the window, processing what I had just heard. It wasn't just about the Henderson contract. It wasn't even just about the 48 million in cancelled contracts. It was about the entire foundation of Atlas's government business, built over 12 years, crumbling because a manager with an MBA couldn't understand the difference between managing spreadsheets and managing relationships. Vincent knocked softly on the door. "Everything okay? You've been in there a while." Colonel Burns just explained something to me that I'd never fully understood. What was that? For 8 years, I thought I was working for Atlas, building relationships that benefited the company, investing my time, my expertise, my personal credibility to make the company grow. But from the client's perspective, from the perspective of the people who actually sign the contracts and approve the payments, the relationship was always with me, personally. The company was just the administrative structure through which we did business. Atlas was the letterhead, but I was the contract. Vincent came in and sat across from me. "That's not uncommon in government contracting, Arthur. It's the nature of the business. Technical expertise and security clearances are personal assets. They don't transfer with the company letterhead. Government clients invest years building trust with specific individuals. They're not going to throw that away and start from scratch just because someone changed companies." Richard never understood that. No, he didn't. He saw government contracts as company assets that could be managed by anyone with the right business training, as if relationships were interchangeable, as if trust could be transferred through an internal memo. And now he's finding out in the most painful way possible that $48 million in annual contract revenue was never really Atlas's. It was yours, and you were generously sharing it with them. The difference is subtle but absolutely critical. My phone buzzed again with another call from John. I declined it without a second thought. "Vincent, I need to ask you something. How many of Strategic's government relationships depend on specific individuals? How many of our contracts are really about people, not the company?" He thought for a moment. "About 60%, maybe more. Government clients don't care about corporate structure or management philosophy or who has what MBA from what university. They care about competence, reliability, a demonstrated ability to deliver complex projects, and trust built over years of consistent work. All of those are personal qualities, not corporate ones. So when Richard told me I was easily replaceable, he was telling you, without realizing it, that he fundamentally did not understand the business he was supposed to be managing. Classic corporate blindness, focusing on org charts instead of relationship maps, valuing titles and academic credentials over expertise and client trust. That afternoon, a former colleague named Stephen texted me. Stephen worked in engineering at Atlas, far enough from the government division not to be at the center of the storm, but close enough to see everything that was happening. "Arthur, you need to know. Richard called an all-hands meeting for this afternoon, 3 o'clock. He's calling it a crisis strategy meeting and says he's going to explain how we're going to overcome some temporary setbacks." I showed the text to Vincent. He laughed, a humorless sound. "Temporary setbacks. As if losing half your annual revenue is comparable to a delay in a materials shipment." At 5:30, Stephen sent me a summary of the meeting. I read it with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Richard spent an hour explaining how we're going to overcome the current challenges through strategic partnerships and enhanced business development. He actually said, and I'm quoting verbatim, that losing the government contracts might be a blessing in disguise because government work is too restrictive and limits our strategic flexibility. John was sitting in the front row looking like he wanted to melt into the floor. Half the people in the room were clearly trying not to roll their eyes. The other half were openly looking for jobs on their phones. I showed the message to Vincent. He shook his head slowly. Your ex-boss is about to learn that some blessings come with very expensive price tags, and that $48 million in annual revenue isn't too restrictive. It's the difference between a profitable company and one struggling to survive. 3 days into my new position at Strategic Solutions, Vincent called me into his office with a proposal that made me understand Richard's world wasn't just crumbling. It was about to be completely absorbed. Arthur, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about relationship-based contracting, and about the collapse of Atlas's government division. What if I told you Strategic has been waiting for this exact opportunity for 2 years? I leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of opportunity? Vincent pulled out a thick folder filled with contract proposals, relationship maps, and competitive analyses. The opportunity to completely absorb Atlas's government division, not through traditional competition for individual contracts, but by hiring the person who built the entire operation. We've been tracking Atlas's government business for years, waiting for the right moment to make a move. Your old company has excellent government relationships, but limited technical and financial capacity. Strategic has enormous capacity, deep financial resources, top-tier facilities, but limited government relationships outside of a few legacy contracts. And now we have both. Exactly. Colonel Burns called me personally yesterday, not just about the Henderson contract. She wants to fast-track the Henderson contract with Strategic as the prime contractor, and you as the designated technical lead, obviously. But she's also actively recommending us for 3 other projects that would have previously gone automatically to other firms. Projects worth over $20 million combined, because you're with us now. I studied the documents he had spread across the table. Wright-Patterson wasn't just offering to transfer the existing radar modernization contract. They were offering a significant extension worth $20 million over 5 years, contingent on my direct involvement. Aberdeen wanted to expand its testing facility project to include Strategic's superior manufacturing capabilities, something Atlas could never have provided. The numbers were staggering. Vincent, this isn't just about hiring me away from Atlas. This is about systematically absorbing their entire government client base, turning one of Strategic's biggest weaknesses, limited government relationships, into one of our greatest strengths. Precisely. And all of it is possible because one insecure manager with an MBA thought relationships built over 12 years were interchangeable, because he confused the letterhead with the actual relationship, because he told an irreplaceable expert that he was easily replaceable. That afternoon, I made a series of methodically planned calls to contract officers and procurement officials I had worked with for years. Each conversation followed the same basic pattern, but each was personalized to the specific relationship I had with that person. I explained my move to Strategic Solutions, emphasized my continued commitment to excellence and on-time delivery, and immediately they wanted to know about transferring existing contracts and exploring new opportunities that Strategic's superior capabilities made possible. Major Helen Rogers from Aberdeen was the most direct. Arthur, I'll be honest with you. The current management at Atlas seems to think government contracting is just paperwork and process, that any MBA with a PowerPoint presentation can manage defense projects that involve classified technology and national security. We need partners who understand that these projects can't be managed like residential construction. We need people like you, with real operational experience, appropriate security clearances, and a proven track record of delivering complex projects under tight schedule and security constraints. By the end of that week, just 5 days after I had signed with Strategic, we had received formal requests for proposal for 6 major contracts previously designated for Atlas or its direct competitors. The total value exceeded $70 million over the next 4 years. More importantly, each request included language that essentially designated me as mandatory key personnel. Richard called me directly on Friday afternoon. His voice had that strained quality of someone desperately trying to maintain professional composure while his world falls apart. Arthur, look, this is getting out of hand. John is willing to discuss a very significant raise and a substantial promotion if you'll seriously consider coming back. I was in the new Government Contracts Division office at Strategic. a space Vincent had set up specifically to accommodate the business we were actively absorbing from Atlas. Floor-to-ceiling windows, brand new secure communications equipment, ergonomic workstations, everything designed to support top-tier government contract operations. What kind of promotion, Richard? Sir, director level. Your own department, reporting directly to John. I would report to you on all government matters, complete autonomy over contracts, personnel, budget, everything you've always wanted. Interesting. What exactly changed John's mind about the value of specialized expertise versus MBA credentials? Richard's voice turned defensive. Look, maybe I was wrong about a few things. Maybe I didn't fully appreciate the complexity of government relationships. But you are deliberately destroying a company that gave you 12 years of opportunity. You're ruining the careers of innocent people who work at Atlas. Richard, let me be absolutely clear. I am not destroying anything. I am simply working at a place that fundamentally understands the difference between management credentials and real industry expertise. I'm working at a place where 12 years of relationship building is valued, not dismissed with a casual comment about being easily replaceable. The board is asking tough questions, Arthur. They want to know how we lost 48 million in active contracts in 1 week. They're demanding explanations, accountability. Some of them are talking about replacing the entire executive leadership. And what are you telling them? I'm telling them that some disgruntled employees act vindictively and unethically when they don't get their way. That you are intentionally sabotaging the company for petty personal reasons. I looked out the window at the Memphis skyline, the same magnificent view I had the day I signed with Strategic. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Are you also telling them that you never obtained the necessary security clearance for the contracts you were supposed to be managing? That you never personally worked on a single government project from start to finish? That you treated technical expertise and long-standing relationships as if they were interchangeable commodities? That you told your only government contracts expert, in front of colleagues, that he was easily replaceable? Richard hung up without answering. An hour later, John called, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge of desperation. Arthur, I need you to understand something before this situation becomes completely unrecoverable. Richard is gone. Effective immediately. I personally fired him this afternoon. I am prepared to offer you his position as Vice President of Government Contracts, plus substantial equity in the company, plus an immediate 40% salary increase, 15 additional vacation days per year, your own departmental budget, any resources you need. John, that is extraordinarily generous and I genuinely appreciate the recognition, but I'm curious about something. Why did absolutely none of this matter 3 days ago? When Richard was convinced I was easily replaceable and you apparently agreed with that assessment. Because I trusted his assessment of the situation. Because I thought he understood the business he was managing. I was wrong and I'm admitting it now. And now, after losing 48 million in contracts, after the board is demanding answers, now you suddenly understand my value. Well, now I know exactly what it feels like to lose 48 million in contract revenue because I made stupid assumptions about who was important and who was easily replaceable. The call came on Monday morning. Exactly 1 week after my resignation, Vincent knocked on my office door with a smile I had never seen before, a mixture of satisfaction and something close to awe. Arthur, you really need to hear this. Put your coffee down. He put his phone on speaker and turned up the volume. John Roberts' voice filled the room, tense with barely controlled panic and defeated resignation. Vincent, I'm calling to discuss what I hope can be a mutually beneficial strategic partnership opportunity between Strategic and Atlas. Vincent leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. What kind of partnership do you have in mind, John? We want to propose that Strategic operationally take over our entire government division through a long-term subcontracting agreement. Strategic would handle all government contracting, and Atlas would focus exclusively on commercial and industrial projects, where frankly our core competencies have always been anyway. That's an interesting proposal. How exactly would that agreement be structured? First, Strategic would assume management of all existing government contracts and relationships. Atlas would provide administrative support as needed and access to our facilities for any manufacturing needs. Revenue would be split initially on a 60-40 basis in Strategic's favor, with potential for renegotiation after the first year based on performance. I leaned forward and spoke directly into the phone. "Hello, John. It's good to hear from you again." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 10 full seconds. When John finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of professional control. "Arthur, I should have realized you'd be deeply involved in this conversation. Of course you would be." "Actually, John, I'm not just involved in this conversation. I am fundamentally this conversation. Every government relationship you're trying to license to Strategic, every contract you're desperately trying to salvage, every client you're trying to retain, they all belong to me personally, not to Atlas." The clients made that absolutely clear through their actions last week. "Arthur, please be reasonable. Atlas invested 12 full years in your professional development, and Richard spent 3 systematic years explaining, to both me and anyone who would listen, how easily replaceable that investment was. Turns out he was spectacularly wrong about that assessment. And now you're all paying the price for believing him." Vincent took over, his voice professional but with a sharp edge. "John, here is our formal counterproposal. Strategic Solutions will seriously consider acquiring the tangible assets of Atlas's government division: physical office space, equipment, furniture, and willing administrative staff, at fair market value as determined by an independent appraisal. All active contracts, all established client relationships, and all rights to pursue future business with government clients remain exclusively with Arthur and Strategic, non-negotiable. That would completely eliminate our entire government division. That's half of our historical annual revenue." "Yes," I said quietly, "it would. Just as Richard effectively eliminated it last week when he told me I was easily replaceable. The only difference is that now you fully understand what that means in concrete financial terms. The board is meeting this afternoon, Arthur. Special emergency meeting. They're going to demand detailed explanations. Recovery plans, heads to roll. What the hell am I supposed to tell them? Tell them the absolute truth, John. Tell them that Richard Vance managed to lose $48 million in annual revenue through a toxic combination of arrogance, ignorance about the industry he was supposed to be managing, and fundamental disrespect for the person who actually generated all of those contracts. Tell them that easily replaceable were possibly the 3 most expensive words ever spoken in the corporate history of Atlas." John's voice audibly cracked. "What do you really want, Arthur? Revenge? Satisfaction? To see the company you helped build completely destroyed? I want Richard to understand on a deep, visceral level what easily replaceable really means when you apply it to the wrong person. I want you to understand the cost of valuing MBA credentials over real industry expertise. And I want to work at a place where 12 years of dedication and relationship building are valued appropriately, not casually dismissed." 2 weeks later, I was sitting comfortably in my new office at Strategic Solutions, reviewing contract specifications for the Henderson project, when Stephen called with fresh and fascinating news from Atlas. Richard was officially fired yesterday afternoon. The board meeting lasted 6 full hours. Apparently it was brutal. John is taking direct personal control of what's left of the so-called government division, but as you well know, there's practically nothing left to control. It's like being named captain of a ship that has already sunk. And the rest of the staff, most of the administrative support staff were transferred to Strategic with the acquisition of the physical assets, right? The ones who stayed are working on commercial projects now. Engineering is focusing entirely on industrial construction and commercial projects. About half the historical revenue base, but at least it's relatively stable. Nobody's firing the structural engineers because they don't have a massive ego. And Richard, personally, has he found another position? That's the really interesting part, Arthur. Word is he's having serious trouble finding anything, even in related industries. The government contracting sector is a surprisingly small and interconnected world, as you well know. And literally everyone knows exactly what happened. The story spread like wildfire. The Emory MBA who chased away $48 million because he couldn't understand that some people really aren't easily replaceable. Nobody wants to hire the guy who destroyed an entire profitable business through sheer arrogance and industry ignorance. I looked out my office window. I was really starting to genuinely like Memphis. The river, the vibrant energy of the city, the palpable sense of possibility that came from working at a place that valued authentic expertise over inflated corporate ego. Stephen, thanks for keeping me posted. I genuinely appreciate you staying in touch. Arthur, there's one more thing you need to know. Colonel Burns called John directly yesterday, not through normal official channels. She wanted to make absolutely sure he clearly understood this was nothing personal against Atlas as a company. She made a point of saying you had always been exceptionally professional over the years, and that Strategic was extraordinarily lucky to have you. She praised you specifically for never bad-mouthing Atlas even after you left. That was kind and generous of her to acknowledge. But then she also said, and again I'm quoting what I heard from someone who was literally in the room, that Richard's behavior was a professional embarrassment to the entire defense contracting industry, and that his reputation was permanently and irreparably tarnished among serious procurement professionals nationwide. She apparently told John that Richard should consider changing industries entirely because he will never work in government contracting again. After the call ended, I sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes. Vincent knocked and walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. Everything okay? You look thoughtful. Just reflecting on how dramatically things change in 2 weeks. 3 weeks ago, Richard was supremely convinced that MBA, credentials, and abstract management theory were infinitely more valuable than 12 years of meticulous relationship building and deep technical expertise. And now he knows the difference, painfully. Now he viscerally understands that some people really aren't easily replaceable. In the following months, Richard's professional downfall became a widely cited cautionary tale throughout the interconnected defense contracting industry. His name circulated regularly in the procurement offices of the Pentagon, at industry conferences, in informal conversations in hotel bars, always as a perfect example of how corporate arrogance combined with fundamental industry ignorance could catastrophically destroy years of carefully built relationships. Began methodically reviewing the expanded Henderson contract specifications. Colonel Burns wanted to significantly accelerate the timeline, leveraging Strategic's superior technical capabilities, and we clearly had all the necessary resources to deliver substantially ahead of the original schedule. This would not have been remotely possible at Atlas. When Richard persistently applied for management positions at other reputable defense sector companies, his references inevitably included mention of the fact that he had, essentially single-handedly through spectacular mismanagement, eliminated $48 million in annual revenue through disastrous personnel decisions and a fundamental, almost comical misunderstanding of how highly specialized industries actually operate. His carefully crafted LinkedIn profile remained essentially unchanged for many months, a silent but eloquent testament to his growing inability to find comparable employment in an industry where personal reputation often mattered far more than impressive academic credentials. The relatively small and interconnected community of defense contracting professionals, particularly in the concentrated regions of Memphis, Atlanta, Washington, and Huntsville, repeatedly used Richard's spectacular case as a practical teaching example of how firing or alienating highly specialized talent could catastrophically and perhaps irreparably damage a company's competitive position. Contract officers who had worked professionally with me for years made it absolutely clear, both in private conversations and in some cases in official communications, that Richard's dismissive treatment of genuinely experienced professionals reflected extremely poorly on his judgment, his leadership capabilities, and his fundamental suitability for senior management positions in complex industries. His subsequent attempts to rebuild his career in traditional commercial construction were consistently hampered by the surprisingly interconnected nature of the broader industry. Former colleagues and industry competitors quickly heard about the spectacular collapse of Atlas's government division. Stories spread. Reputations were permanently stained. Richard's growing professional isolation deepened significantly when the visible and well-documented successes of Strategic solutions with the former Atlas contracts became regular industry news. Each project completed with exceptional success. Under my direct leadership at Strategic served as a public and unequivocal reminder of what Richard had recklessly thrown away through his consistently dismissive attitude and fundamental mismanagement. His professional reputation never genuinely recovered from being permanently the executive who proved conclusively, through spectacular failure, that some people really are truly irreplaceable, while others are not only easily forgotten, but actively avoided. I signed the significantly expanded renewal of the Henderson contract in Colonel Burns's formal office 6 months later, surrounded by the exact same dedicated team of procurement professionals I had worked with productively for years. The expanded contract was now worth $35 million over 4 years, significantly larger than the original Atlas version, because it incorporated technical capabilities that only Strategic could provide. Colonel Burns shook my hand firmly after the final signatures. "Arthur, sometimes organizations need to learn painful lessons about the value of their best people. Atlas learned that lesson in the most expensive way possible. Strategic clearly already understood. Sometimes, reflecting quietly on everything that happened, I recognize that the most valuable and enduring lesson is fundamentally simple. Authentic respect, earned through demonstrated competence and genuine dedication, will always, inevitably, outweigh any artificial authority that comes merely from an impressive corner office and an expensive degree from a prestigious university."